Have you ever mistaken strength for armor? Have you ever called it resilience when it was really avoidance? Ever worn ambition like a suit of iron? Tight, cold, beautiful, only to discover that the first real wound cut straight through. Not the body, the ego. Have you ever built a life so perfectly on the outside that not even you could admit how hollow it felt inside? Carried expectations like bricks in your chest, smiled when you were bleeding, laughed when you were collapsing? He did. He was a knight, iron-willed, sword in hand, trained to conquer and command. Status, war, women, power, he had them all. And he thought that made him a man. But life doesn't care how well armored you are, because life knows exactly where to strike. And one day, it did. A cannonball shattered his leg. But that wasn't the real explosion. That was just the echo. What broke was everything he couldn't name. His identity, his illusion, his mask. He lay in bed, crippled and humiliated. Not just in body, but in soul. No more battlefield. No more admirers. Just silence, stillness, and the deafening sound of his own inner world, finally screaming to be heard. In that moment, when he could no longer perform, chase, or seduce, he met something he had run from his entire life. Himself. Saint Ignatius of Loyola is not remembered because he was born good. He is remembered because he was broken and still chose to rise, not by denying his weakness, but by letting it bury his false self, not by climbing higher, but by descending into the very depths of his trauma, his pride, his shame, his buried rage. He didn't flinch. He walked into the darkness, and he didn't come back the same. This is not a story. This is not hagiography. This is an autopsy of pride, a manual of psychological war, a resurrection through fire and ruin. Because healing doesn't come from comfort. It doesn't come from prayers whispered at a distance. It doesn't come from pretending you're fine. It comes from confrontation, from silence, from collapse, from watching the house of your ego burn, and still choosing to stand in the ash. If you've been running from your own shadow, if your smile hides a scream, if you've mastered control but lost connection, if you're haunted by a pain you can't quite name, then this isn't just a story you need to hear. It's a mirror you need to face. Because Ignatius isn't physically here to make you comfortable. Here are 10 points to show you how to fight trauma like a soul set on fire. And now, your reckoning begins. He thought he was invincible. Not in the way of modern delusion, but in the way of men who were never taught to feel. Ignatius wasn't just raised, he was forged. Bred in the myths of chivalry, conquest, and eternal honor, he believed in one thing above all: that the world only respects the man who never bleeds. He worshipped strength, not because he didn't feel weakness, but because he was taught to bury it. To be a man meant to dominate or be dominated. To fall was shame. To bend was dishonor. To break was to cease existing. So he built his life like a fortress. Steel on the outside, fire on the inside. He carried his pride like a sword, sharp and relentless. He wrapped his ego in charm, in strategy, in women and war and wins. He didn't confess, he conquered. Didn't kneel, he commanded. To him, pain was for peasants, emotions for the weak. But trauma doesn't care what armor you wear. It always finds the gap. In 1521, the cannonball came, not just through his leg, but through his illusion. It hid during battle, Loyola, defending the city walls, thinking once again that glory would be his. But this time, the battle didn't make a legend. It made a ghost. Bone exploded. Flesh twisted. Blood covered the ground like spilled wine. The man who once stormed into cities on horseback now lay in a heap, helpless, half-conscious, writhing. He was rushed back to his family's castle. But there was no triumph. No applause. No woman to cry over him. Just the echo of footsteps down hallways. And then, the bed. Weeks turned to months. He couldn't move. Couldn't walk. Could barely breathe. The knight, the leader, the man with a mission, reduced to a broken body and the four walls around him. But that wasn't the real pain. The real pain was the silence. Because when the crowds are gone, when your name means nothing, when the future you idolized is ripped from you without warning, what's left? Only one thing, you. And if you've never truly faced that person, what you find there isn't peace. It's terror. Modern psychology calls this moment ego death, the collapse of persona. Jung described it as the psychic shattering of the mask we wear to survive the world. And for Ignatius, that mask wasn't just cracked, it was obliterated. The titles, the reputation, the ambition, gone. And what emerged in its place? Nothing. Just a raw, fragmented, disoriented self, untethered from meaning, stripped of identity. Because that's what trauma does. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just takes everything away. The motion, the direction, the noise, the narrative. And what you're left with is a silence that's louder than war. If you hunger for truth, dare to subscribe now. Unseen Saints brings you the unvarnished wisdom of the past, delivered straight to today's restless heart. Alone in that room, bedridden, forgotten, stripped of rank and purpose, Ignatius of Loyola came face to face with the most terrifying adversary a man can meet: his own psyche. At first, it was subtle. He filled the silence with fantasies, heroic rescues, swordplay, applause, women waiting, enemies trembling. He imagined himself riding again, armor shining, regaining the dignity he thought the world had stolen. These weren't just daydreams. They were his anesthesia. Each fantasy was a morphine drip, briefly numbing the rawness of his collapse. But trauma, left unexamined, does not dissolve. It mutates. And slowly, the silence around him began to grow teeth. What once felt like comfort became confrontation. And the fantasies, the glorious self-illusions, began to rot. He found himself replaying the same memories over and over until they turned sour. Not because the battles had changed, but because he had. Something beneath the surface was stirring. Not a demon, a reckoning. Jung called it the shadow, the repressed, unaccepted, disowned parts of ourselves that fester in the unconscious until life finally forces them into the light. And for Ignatius, the shadow was not vague. It was surgical. Every title he clung to, every conquest he boasted of, every manipulation he justified, every glance in the mirror where he mistook pride for purpose, all of it surfaced. The vanity, the arrogance, the jealousy, the entitlement, the way he had used others to avoid facing himself, the way he had turned love into a transaction, the way he had fed off admiration like a starving child. He wasn't just a wounded soldier. He was a man addicted to validation. And now, with no audience to impress, no war to win, and no mirror to pose in, the lie he had lived began to collapse in on itself. He realized his identity had been a costume, stitched together with fear and sealed with applause. The more he stared at that truth, the more his inner armor cracked. Not because the shadow was evil, but because it was honest. That's what makes the shadow unbearable. Not its darkness, but its clarity. You see, Trauma is not just about what happens to you. It's about what awakens within you when the identity you built to survive finally dies. And this is what Ignatius faced, hour after hour, trapped in stillness. The slow dismantling of the self he thought was strong. He began noticing the patterns, not just in his memories, but in his inner reactions. Why did he despise weakness in others? Why did he crave admiration so badly it made him restless? Why did silence feel like a threat instead of a refuge? These weren't questions of theology. These were questions of psychic survival. He started to see a thread, a single root behind all his ambition, control, and rage. Woundedness. A wound from long before the cannonball. From childhood. From being unseen. From never feeling enough. He couldn't name it, but he could feel it. It burned behind every desire. It shaped every pursuit. It whispered behind every decision. He was not choosing life. He was reacting to an old injury, over and over again. And in the mirror of that wound, he saw something no knight is trained to face. Not a monster, but a child. The child beneath the soldier. The soul beneath the scar. The part of him that was never angry, only abandoned. That didn't crave power, only peace. That didn't seek dominance, only dignity. And once seen, that child could never be unseen. This was not the beginning of sainthood. It was the beginning of self-confrontation. In trauma psychology, there's a concept known as complexes, unconscious emotional knots that hijack the personality. They operate like mental landmines, exploding when triggered by shame, guilt, or fear. Freud called them repressions, buried memories that haunt behavior from the shadows. Jung called them subpersonalities, fractured versions of the self, each vying for dominance. Ignatius didn't just study these ideas. He lived them. The moment he began to pray, not casually, but deeply, with the intent of surrendering everything, he found himself under siege. Not from outside forces, but from within. Thoughts poured in, dark, relentless, corrosive. Not just about the things he had done, the vanity, the violence, the lust, but about what he was at his core. Unlovable, corrupt, filthy. It wasn't temptation he was battling. It was identity. His trauma no longer needed a battlefield. It had set up camp inside his soul, turning prayer into psychological warfare. His memories became weapons. His conscience, a courtroom. He was both the accused and the executioner. He became obsessed with purity, scrupulous to the edge of psychosis. He would examine his conscience for hours, combing through his past like a detective in a crime scene. Every forgotten sin was a ticking time bomb. Every impure thought was a betrayal. He confessed his sins repeatedly, for hours, to the point where priests, exhausted, bewildered, refused to hear him. It wasn't piety. It wasn't penance. It was a spiritual form of self-harm. This wasn't holiness. This was trauma wearing a cassock. He believed that if he could just be perfect, utterly clean, morally flawless, then maybe he would be worthy of love, worthy of God, worthy of existing. But perfection is the devil's trick. It promises control, but it delivers obsession. And in trying to dominate every inch of his interior life, Ignatius nearly destroyed it. He became trapped in the illusion that God wanted purity more than honesty, sacrifice more than surrender. He couldn't see that what God desired most was him. Not a purified version of him. Not a flawless soul. But the bleeding, broken man with trembling hands and a haunted mind. His ego, the false self that said, "I must earn love or die," had to be exorcised. Not with holy water, but with surrender. This was the turning point. Not a single, cinematic moment, but a slow, excruciating death of the self he had built to survive the world. A knight's armor doesn't work in the presence of God. It must be peeled away, piece by piece. And as his ego shattered, something else began to rise. Not perfection, not pride, but peace. The kind that doesn't need to be earned. And then came the cave. Literally. Near the river Cardona, Ignatius went into seclusion, into a stone cave, alone with his madness. No more priests. No more books. No more distractions. This was his dark night of the soul. The cave was no sanctuary. It was a crucible. He fasted. He wept. He despaired. He considered suicide. Everything he had repressed came pouring out. Memories, rage, shame, and a silence so deep it felt like death itself. But in that abyss, something shifted. He stopped trying to control God. He stopped trying to earn love. He stopped running from pain. And for the first time, he listened. To the broken child inside. To the darkness. To God, not as a judge, but as a presence that had been waiting in the wound all along. This is what Jung meant by individuation. To descend into the unconscious. To face the shadow. To return, not with perfection, but with integration. Out of the ashes of his ego, Ignatius emerged with something new. Not sainthood. Not serenity. A system. The spiritual exercises were not written by a theologian. They were written by a man who had faced his own psychic annihilation and survived. They are not prayers. They are psychological weapons. They guide you through memory, through emotion, through imagination. They teach you to observe your thoughts, track your triggers, reflect without flinching. Modern therapists call this cognitive restructuring. Ignatius called it discernment. It's trauma therapy, disguised as devotion. He taught men how to listen to their internal voices, how to distinguish between consolation and desolation, how to see when the soul is being hijacked by fear, by addiction, by the lies of a wounded past. He didn't offer escape. He offered confrontation. Because healing is not a retreat. It's a campaign. Ignatius never fully healed, not the way modern minds wish he had. He still limped, still battled scrupulosity, still bore the scars of war, both on his leg and in his psyche. But he was no longer controlled by his past. Why? Because he had integrated it. He had learned the art of turning wounds into wisdom, of letting pain educate the soul instead of dominate it, of embracing brokenness, not as something to be fixed, but as something to be offered. He no longer sought applause. He no longer feared failure. He no longer chased perfection. He walked with presence, with awareness, with power that came not from armor, but from authenticity. Carl Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Ignatius lived that. He didn't become whole because he prayed the right words. He became whole because he stopped running from the parts of himself that were hardest to love. And that's what makes him a saint. Not miracles, not martyrdom, but this. He faced his shadow and didn't flinch. You're not holding a sword, but your war is just as real. Maybe your trauma didn't come from a cannonball, but from a divorce. From a father who wasn't there. From a betrayal, a failure, a silence you still don't know how to name. Maybe you've mastered survival. You wear smiles like shields. Grind harder. Push forward. But something inside still bleeds. Quietly. Always. You've mistaken control for healing. Achievement for transformation. But the pain never left. It just learned how to hide better. Ignatius would tell you, stop. Stop performing. Stop pretending. Stop polishing your armor and go into the cave. Not to be destroyed, but to meet the part of you you've buried. The one still asking, am I enough? Am I lovable? Am I safe? Because that question won't leave you alone until you answer it. Not with noise, but with presence. Not with more doing, but with being. You don't need a cassock or a crucifix. You need courage. Ignatius didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered structure. And those same tools can become your weapons. 1. Radical self-examination. Each night, review your day. Where did you feel fear? Envy? Joy? Rage? What does it reveal about what still owns you? This is not judgment. This is data. Your wounds speak through patterns. 2. Discernment of spirits. Learn to feel what thoughts elevate your soul, and which ones constrict it. What Jung called alignment of the self, Ignatius called consolation. Pay attention. Your psyche is trying to guide you back to wholeness. 3. Imaginative prayer. Ignatius taught his men to place themselves inside the stories of Scripture, not to escape reality, but to recode their inner world. Psychologists now call this visualization therapy, but he used it to create new identities, new responses, new internal truths. 4. Shadow dialogue. Write a letter to the version of you hate the most. Let them speak. Ask what they need. This isn't therapy, it's spiritual warfare. 5. Silence. Ignatius' deepest transformation didn't come from noise. It came in the cave. And you must create your own. 10 minutes a day. No music. No screen. No role to perform. Just you and the part of you still waiting to be seen. You've been lied to. You were told that to be loved, you had to be flawless. That to matter, you had to win. That to be spiritual, you had to be serene. Ignatius says, no. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be present. You don't need to conquer the shadow. You need to stop denying it exists. You don't need to run faster. You need to sit in the cave and listen to the ache, and not look away. Because what you reject in yourself becomes your master. But what you integrate becomes your power. Saint Ignatius is not a plaster saint with folded hands and empty eyes. He is a battlefield. A battlefield where trauma was met not with denial, but with truth. Where the ego died so the soul could live. Where God wasn't a distant judge, but a companion in the cave. He was not strong because he avoided pain. He was strong because he let it rip him apart, and rebuilt himself with what remained. He didn't chase sainthood. He chased wholeness. And that's the real miracle. If this spoke to something buried in you, then write this in the comments. My trauma is not my master. I am becoming whole. Because that sentence might not just change your life. It might give someone else permission to begin. If you enjoyed this video, you may subscribe now. Unseen Saints brings you the unvarnished wisdom of the past, delivered straight to today's restless heart. See you in the next video.